I'm Andrea Donsky, host of New Hope Network Soapbox Series, and today I'm here with Charlie Bradbury, head of the Specialty Brands Group for JBS USA Food Company, and Lisa Skebby, marketing director for JBS USA Beef and for Grass Run Farms. Welcome to the show, Charlie and Lisa.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here.
I'd like to start from the beginning, and I'd like to know what makes Grass Run Farms so unique.
Well, really what is probably most unique about us and kind of drives our whole process is we're very focused on a quality eating experience. As you know, a tremendous percentage of grass-fed beef that is consumed in the United States is imported product. Our product is 100% born, raised, and harvested in the United States. The cost of production for many of these imported programs is much lower than the cost of production for grass-fed beef in the US. So we're never going to compete with them on price. The place we can compete with them is on a quality eating experience. And we think that's extremely important. So everything that we do is really built around that.
What do grass-fed cattle eat? Are they on a 100% grass-fed diet, or are they grain finished? I'd love to understand what it means when you're thinking about grass-fed beef.
Sure. So, there's a lot of misconceptions. First off, you got to understand that grass is the largest plant species family. So there are tremendous numbers of plants that are grass. Okay. People don't realize that corn is a grass. Okay. So you can actually utilize a whole cafeteria of forages as long as you don't utilize grain. So what the cattle in our program are eating is a combination of a very high quality grazing diet where they are really the producers use a sort of a cafeteria style where they'll fill their planter with a tremendous variety of grasses. They use a lot of spring oats when they're planting in the spring, but they'll put brassicas in there, which is like a kale or a turnip even. They'll mix in a lot of grasses that will mature at different times, trying to have a steady diet across that grazing season. But then what we do that's very unique is you have to figure out a way to remove the inconsistency in that diet. So the way we address that is we figured out we could use stored forages. So these farmers produce silage is a great example. So they'll go in there and harvest that plant when all the sugar is in that stalk, when it's right at its mature stage, before it forms any kind of seed head. And then they'll chop it up, got a big machine that chops it up, and then they'll put it in a silo, which oftentimes is just a big hole in the ground, a concrete lined bunk, they call it. It can be the old traditional silo that you see when you drive through the Midwest, but really most of them have gotten away from those because they're not very efficient. A lot of them now use big plastic bags. They'll fill that bag up with that chopped forage, and then they seal it. So you cut the oxygen off, and that allows it to ensile. It basically goes through a process, becomes much more digestible to the animal. Energy content goes way up. Then they chop that up, and we feed that to these cattle while they're grazing. We feed it to them every day of their life, which is a very challenging thing to do because you got to follow the cattle around the pastures they're in, bring this ration to them. But that eliminates that inconsistency while they're still eating a forage diet. Does that make sense?
It definitely does. And it sounds like there's a lot of regulation in place, which is nice to hear when it comes to it. And one of the things I always think about when I think of grass-fed beef is how they're humanely raised. And I was curious what humanely raised means for your company specifically.
That's an interesting subject also. So it's always amazed me, you're probably familiar with Temple Grandin, who really was the person who more than anybody in the last 20 years made us all aware of animal welfare and how important it is. She's a PhD animal scientist from Colorado State University. And most of her work initially was actually all focused on the harvest facility. And it's interesting that what she showed us all, and some of us kind of knew it, but maybe didn't put it all together as well as she did, is that if you change the way you're treating those cattle, you actually end up producing better beef, because it turns out that stress has a lot to do with tenderness issues. Okay. And when she came along, the beef industry, especially those of us in the harvesting business, totally changed what we do. We spent millions of dollars to rebuild those harvest facilities so that the animal doesn't have stress, right? And she showed us how to do that.
So one of the things that is really important to consumers, of course, is this humanely raised aspect to really all beef, right? And so when we think about grass-fed beef, there's even a heightened concern or interest there with consumers. And so a lot of consumers believe that, grass-fed beef cattle are more humanely raised than maybe conventional beef, right? So that's kind of that misconception. And going back to what Charlie said, really all of our producers are BQA certified on the grass-fed end, and we work with a small network of producers. And so we have really close relationships with those producers, and we are program verified by a third-party auditor, right? So not only are they required to be BQA certified, we actually have a third-party auditor who goes on site at least once a year and then checks, all of the records weekly to make sure that our producers are following our strict program standards, whether that be a feeding regimen or, handling practices, those types of things.
One of the things that pops into mind for me when I hear you and Charlie speak about the regulations and the amount of effort and work that goes into raising grass-fed cattle is supply. Is there enough supply to meet the demand?
Well, that is a constant effort that we employ. So to answer your question the way you asked it, yes, there is enough supply to meet the demand. The demand is growing very rapidly. We've had tremendous growth in our system. And so it's a question of converting producers who may have been in a commodity system to meeting what we're trying to do. And so that takes some time. I mean, this whole life cycle is at least a 2-year, closer to a 3-year process. So but we have developed an infrastructure where we can do that pretty quickly. In other words, if we turn a guy on tomorrow to start producing for us, it's going to be 2 years before we get those cattle there. So we're constantly working in advance to do that.
Lisa, I want to just go back to you for a second because you were talking about why consumers want to buy grass-fed beef, and you mentioned the humanely raised, which is an important part. What are some other reasons consumers want to buy grass-fed beef?
Yeah, that's a great question. So consumers are continually looking for healthy protein options to put on the table, right? Especially in the year of 2020. They're looking for products that are going to boost their immune systems, that are going to be delicious, that their kids are going to eat, So going back to that good eating experience is something that's really important, because the cost of grass-fed beef is higher than a conventional product or a regular commodity beef item that a consumer could buy. And so when they do buy it, they definitely want their kids or their family to eat it. So that's one of the biggest things. But the second thing is kind of going back to what Charlie was saying is, the American consumer really has kind of this polarizing situation happening, right? So they want kind of this healthier option, a product that's going to be nutritious, that's going to meet, the humanely raised, concerns, that's going to seem more natural to them, that's not going to have the antibiotics and hormones, but also be delicious. And so that is not an easy thing to deliver on. Just hearing Charlie talk about the complexities of, the grass-fed supply chain and producing that quality product, so being able to put a flavorful, tender and delicious product on the table that is also nutritious is, definitely top of mind for consumers.
You're making me really hungry. I'm like, I need some grass-fed beef right now. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. All right, I have one last question for both of you. Lisa, let's start with you. Since you answered the last question, how do you, Lisa, spark change?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is really understanding the consumer and understanding what they need and what they want and what they're willing to pay for. Right. And so once we understand that, we can really spark change through innovation and through making sure that our product is available and growing that supply chain so we can deliver on that growing demand that we know is there.
Thank you. And Charlie, how about yourself?
The beef industry is actually very focused these days on sustainability and how do we make this a sustainable business over time. And grazing is a huge part of that, and that's what we're all about. So that's how we're sparking change.
I love it. Thank you both for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on New Hope Network Soapbox Series.